All right, well, I might just dive into some introductions and letting you know a little bit more about us for those who may not know. Um, Before we do start, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. For me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Just a little bit about who we are for those who don't know us. TTC stands for the Testing Consultancy, and we're a global quality assurance organisation focused on testing. Our head office is in New Zealand, but we have offices across the world: Australia, US, UK, the Middle East, to name a few. Our team is the digital accessibility practice. So our focus is on ensuring that we can help teams to embed accessibility into their ways of working. We also manage accessibility on behalf of organisations and also provide a range of services, consulting, accessibility audits, usability research and testing that Charlii leads, and obviously we'll hear more about that today. We also offer a range of training courses and coaching, and also undertake design reviews as well. And we're very proud to be part of the valuable 500 global directory assisting companies with accessibility. And just to let you know a little bit of what's coming up on our training schedule, we've got some training coming up this month in relation to document accessibility. So, if anyone is interested in creating and learning how to create accessible documents, we've got two sessions: a fundamentals course and then an advanced documents course where we look in depth at PDF and forms. And then in October, for anyone who's in marketing and communications, we've got a training session specifically designed for you. So this looks at all of the possible accessibility points that you may find in your role in marketing and communications. So I'll put a link in the chat if you want to check those out, or you can scan the QR code on screen. Today, we have our presentation by Charlii, and then we will have time for a Q&A. Just to introduce Charlii quickly, Charlii is our senior usability and accessibility consultant. She leads our inclusive usability testing practice. Charlii is, as I said, a senior usability and accessibility consultant specializing in creating inclusive, user-friendly digital experiences. She has deep expertise in accessibility standards, assistive technologies, and lived experience, and is known for her human-centered approach that she brings to every project, and clear communication style and practical recommendations. So today's webinar is all about the power of user testing as a valuable tool in highlighting those hidden barriers. So if today does spark any ideas or raises any questions about how usability testing might be able to be incorporated or embedded into work that you do to improve the products, please do reach out to Charlii. I'll put the details in the chat, but email, or you can scan the QR code on screen to book a time. So that's enough from me. Without further ado, I will hand over to Charlii.
So, hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for sharing your lunchtime with us. I know that some people aren't able to join the session live today because of time zones or other commitments. So, replay crew, hello to you too. This webinar will be available, the recording will be available following the session as well. So, thank you to Ben for your lovely introduction. Just to give you a little bit more background about me, I first came across digital accessibility back in about 2009 when I was working for the federal government for an agency that was eventually absorbed into Services Australia. And like many people, when I first learned that blind people used computers, I was fascinated. And what started as a fascination became a passion. And luckily for me, I've been able to turn that passion into a career. But the more time I've spent in this space, the more I've realized that digital accessibility really isn't about technology. It's about people, which is lucky because I'm the least IT person that you'll ever meet. Digital accessibility is about what happens when the way we've designed something doesn't match the way that somebody needs to interact with it. But how do we know? How do we measure that? How do we know when it's happening? And I'm going to ask Ben to pop a poll up just to check in when something isn't working for your customers. How often do you consider accessibility as a possible contributing factor? A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about diagnostics and the things we look at and the tools that we use and what we're measuring and where we're seeing problems occur and how accessibility might be an underlying issue to that. Because the interesting thing about digital accessibility is that the problem doesn't always look like an accessibility problem. The problems might look like somebody abandoning a process, a customer that's not engaging, somebody who's taking longer to complete a task, an increase in support calls, a product that isn't being adopted the way that you expected it to. And unless we're specifically looking for accessibility, we might never recognize that it's actually hiding in plain sight in each of those issues. And that's what I want to explore with you today. Because the question that I get asked the most often is, how do we get executive buy-in for accessibility? Because we all know that telling an executive something needs to be done because there are WCAG requirements or because it's the right thing to do isn't always enough to get it prioritized. And I'm not saying that those things aren't important because they are. But when you're trying to get accessibility onto the agenda, to get funding for it, or to embed it in the way an organization works, you need to be able to make a business case. And we know what executives love. They love stats, they love dashboards, they love diagnostics, they love analytics. They want to know what's happening, where it's happening, how big the problem is, and ideally why it's happening. And this is where accessibility can get lost in the weeds. Because organizations are already measuring the symptoms, they're tracking the drop off, they're measuring engagement, adoption, task completion, support calls. The data is already there. The problem is that there's no accessibility dashboard sitting alongside your Google Analytics. Your analytics can tell you where someone came from, what pages they visited, where they dropped off, and whether or not they completed to a conversion. But it can't tell you whether they were using a screen reader. It can't tell you whether they were using screen magnification. It can't tell you whether they were navigating with an alternate input device. And it can't tell you whether an accessibility barrier was the reason that they abandoned the task. You don't know whether someone stopped doing something because they're a busy mum and they got interrupted by kids and they had to put it down and come back later or not come back at all. Or if it was somebody with an accessibility need that hit a barrier that you're not aware of that wasn't able to complete the task. So when we sit in front of the executive and say we have an accessibility problem, the next question from them is often, do people with disabilities use our services? Do they come to our websites? Do screen readers come to our website? How big is the problem? And that's where things get difficult because we don't necessarily have the data to quantify accessibility in the way that executives are used to seeing problems quantified. We can see drop off, we can see low engagement, we can see increased support calls, but we can't necessarily see the accessibility barrier that might be at the root cause. And without that visibility, accessibility can be very difficult to quantify and then therefore very difficult to prioritize. So today, I want to look at accessibility from a slightly different perspective, not just as a compliance requirement, not just as something we do because WCAG tells us to, not just because it's something we do because it's the right thing to do, but through a more diagnostic lens. Because what if accessibility is the one thing that's sitting underneath the problems that you're already seeing in your data? What if the customer who isn't engaging isn't actually uninterested? Or what if the employee who's taking longer isn't actually underperforming? Or what if the customer who keeps needing support doesn't actually need more support? What if the problem isn't the person at all? And what if there's something about the experience that we've created that's getting in their way that we just don't know about? So that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to look at what happens when we take those existing signals, the things that your organization is already measuring, and ask a different question. What's actually getting in the way? And we'll look at how accessibility-focused user research with people using their real assistive technologies to complete real tasks can help us connect the dots between what the data is telling us and what's actually happening underneath it. Because your data can tell you where people are struggling. Accessibility-focused user research can help you understand why. So we have data, and your data is already telling you something. Every organization has data. And when there's no shortage, there's all the data, all the dashboards. Teams know where customers abandon a journey, when a product isn't being adopted, when certain groups are less engaged, when there's a spike in demand for support calls, or it's taking staff longer to complete tasks. The problem isn't that we lack data, it's just that we don't know what the data is really telling us. So, considering your own data, which of these signals do you already track? Customer drop off, product uptake, digital engagement, conversions, form completions, error rates, support calls, average handling time, staff productivity, performance management, engagement across demographic groups, and staff attritions. Have you ever dug into the numbers to see why they look the way they do? And taking that a step further, have you ever considered that they might be related to digital accessibility? So we always see the symptom. We see a problem and then we diagnose the person. So we see that older customers aren't engaging in our digital services. And we say, well, they don't like digital. Older people don't like digital. They're not digital first. And look, I know a lot of lovely old women with iPads and they're always on their iPad. So it's not necessarily that old customers don't want to deal with digital. Customers abandoning an application, well, maybe they changed their mind. They got to a certain point, changed, decided they didn't want it. Internally, employees that are, this employee is slower than their colleagues. They're not meeting their KPIs. It's a performance issue. The form has a higher timeout rate. Well, it's a really long form and it just times out because people are getting their details together and things like that. And this demographic isn't engaging and maybe they're just not interested. In every case, we take a metric and quietly turn it into a judgment about the person. They don't like digital, they change their mind, they're underperforming, they're not interested. None of these assumptions are unreasonable on their own, but they all diagnose the person rather than the symptom. And that's the pattern that we need to interrupt. So the questions we should ask is when someone doesn't complete a task, what happened? Rather than assuming what happened, we need to ask what happened. A customer doesn't adopt a product, what's getting in the way? A staff member takes longer, what's creating the additional effort? And a demographic not engaging, what barrier are they encountering? For each of these four scenarios, the metric only tells us what happened. Someone didn't complete a task, didn't adopt a product, took longer. It never tells us why. And that's the gap that this whole talk is about. Because until we start looking at why and looking at what can be the cause outside of our own assumptions, and whether that cause is digital accessibility, we may never know, and we may never be able to actually help them. So accessibility could be the missing variable. Accessibility problems almost never show up in a dashboard labeled accessibility problem. They show up disguised as the metrics that you're already watching closely: drop-offs, abandonments, timeout, low uptake, increased support demand, longer handling times, higher error rates, staff fatigue, workarounds, vague or low engagement. Accessibility could be the hidden variable connecting the symptoms that you can see to the cause that you can't. So mentally mapping yourself, just take a moment to think about the things on this diagram that I've gone through. And is this something that you're already tracking? And do you know the definite causes of what those drop-offs were? Was the timeout because insert accessibility issue here? There's no diagnostic tool that prints it out in an engaging executive summary that pinpoints where accessibility is letting you down. And the tools are important. The tools that we have are important and they generally tell us something useful. So analytics gives you the what, automated scanners flag technical issues, WCAG audits confirm conformance, and customer feedback surfaces that someone struggled. But none of them on their own tell you the specific human story behind the number. That a screen reader user needed 3 times as long to complete a form. That a magnification user ran out of time because the session expired, because they couldn't find the call to action button because it was off screen and the portion of the screen that they see is so small that they were lost in a big white space and they weren't able to find where they needed to go, and it kept timing out on them. That someone with a tremor couldn't complete repeated precise movements because there's 15 checkboxes on the page and they're trying to get each of those checkboxes, that even though they use a mouse, if they've got a tremor and they can't get that pinpoint accuracy, they might be dropping off. Or that an alternate input device user, so somebody who's using a head pointer, their speed is slowed down. So these are all diagnostic gaps that user testing closes. We don't find out about these things until we speak to and observe people using their tools, using our products, and using our systems. So I've created a diagnostic model. So we've got the signal that something in the data doesn't look right. It then moves to the assumption that we naturally reach for, which is often a reasonable explanation that, older customers aren't using digital. They're not digital first. They prefer face-to-face. They prefer to come into a branch. They prefer to call a call center. That somebody's performance issue is they're just not engaged. Maybe they've got something going on at home. We might not consider that we've just introduced a whole new system in how our call center operates. And now there's 15 more clicks than had to be clicked on before. There's a high cognitive load. There's a higher number of clicks. And now we just see it as a performance issue. So we don't look at those hidden barriers that accessibility might be contributing to the problem, which is why we investigate. We observe real people using real systems. Doing user testing will give you so many more insights than just doing an accessibility audit or just doing any other testing alone or looking at your analytics and making assumptions by what you're seeing. And from looking at people and observing people and asking them questions, we understand the root causes about what's actually preventing success, which finally lets us fix the right problem instead of finding a plausible sounding wrong one. So as we go through, the solution is find the issue, talk to people, and that can be through user testing, through surveys, going through your customer feedback forms and speaking to your staff and not just assuming that it's a staff or a person issue. It could be a system problem. So I've got 3 people here. Now, these are 3 made up people, but they're all based on experiences that I've had through user testing. So we've got Margaret, Jaden, and Aisha. And they're not just personas, they're not just edge cases, they are diagnostic evidence because each of them maps to a completely different organizational metric. So Margaret, low digital engagement. We've sent her so many things and she just doesn't connect online. She keeps calling the call center, she goes into the branch. Jaden's about to find himself on a pip because he is not meeting his metrics, he is not meeting his KPIs, his call handling is not up to standard. And clearly it's a Jaden problem. And then we've got Aisha, and Aisha is constantly calling up because she's constantly having problems finding her information. If on her banking, she's finding that she can't read her statement. So she's calling up to find out about information. So call handling from Aisha. Aisha's constantly calling Jaden. Jaden's call times are getting longer, and Margaret's not talking to anybody. So these are the kind of things that show up in quarterly business reviews with no obvious connections to accessibility. So now we're going to look at some of the user research findings that started out as diagnostic evidence. So Margaret, Jaden, and Aisha represent 3 organizational metrics: low digital engagement, poor staff performance, and high support dependency. But what did we find out when they came in for user testing? So a little bit about Margaret. Margaret is 67. She has low vision. She uses magnification. She uses Zoom. And there is an assumption that she doesn't pick up on any of the marketing things that we send out to her. She doesn't engage. And so we assume that she's just of that older demographic and we're just not capturing that demographic. But what's actually happening is that Margaret can't read the content easily, that forms are taking her longer to complete, that the session time's out for her, and that every time she has to verify, it breaks under magnification. So she's trying to complete her form, she's trying to get to her call to action, and she just can't. So she just goes into the branch because it's just easier for her. So rather than thinking that older customers aren't engaging with digital and that they prefer traditional channels, look at whether they can actually use the digital experiences that we've built. And you won't know until you get Margaret in front of you, looking at Margaret's viewport. So, and quite often in accessibility testing, we test browser zoom, that the page magnifies and that it all reflows and everything is great. And that's fine. And it's very good and it's important and definitely do it. But what is often not considered is that somebody might be using Windows Magnifier, and Margaret's portion of the screen that she can see might just be your logo in the top corner, which is your home call to action button. And that's all that she gets on her screen because she has magnified her screen to 650, 700%. And so everything that Margaret does, she has to scan across, and it takes a lot longer. And Margaret's often getting lost in the snow, which is like the big portions of white space where she moves across and across and across and thinks, nope, nothing here, goes back and starts again. And she keeps moving across and coming back. If you're not looking at the world through Margaret's lens, you will never understand Margaret's experience. So we think that Margaret doesn't want to engage with digital. But Margaret didn't reject digital, digital rejected Margaret. So when you see Margaret's low adoption, you assume that it's low preference. But seeing Margaret's viewport showed that Margaret just couldn't do what was being asked of her because it was never looked at through her lens. So her accessibility needs are how much content she can see, how quickly she can read, how she navigates, and how long the tasks take. So it wasn't that older users don't want digital, it was time plus magnification and task complexity. So the audit said the text could be resized, that browser zoom worked, but user testing looks at what happens when a real person resizes it and tries to complete the task in the way that they need to do it. Then we've got Jaden. Poor Jaden. Jaden's about to be on a PIP. Jaden's 29. He's got ADHD and he has a repetitive strain injury. And he works in a call center. And the call center's just introduced a brand new system on how claims are being done. And what used to be 3 screens for Jaden in the old system is now 15 screens because the way the system's been built is that they want to capture more data from the customer with those interactions. So now Jaden is suddenly in a heavy mouse interaction environment, but he prefers to use keyboard because of his RSI. So that means that there's complex tool switching, there's unpredictable focus. As he tabs around, things jump. So then he's got to find out where he is, move back to where he wants to be. It's a higher cognitive load, which is harder for Jaden with his ADHD. Now, the data says that Jaden's slower. Jaden's not meeting his KPIs. Jaden's not taking the call numbers that he should be, and he's not processing as fast as other people, which is obviously a performance issue. We need to get HR involved because Jaden isn't meeting what he needs to do. When we get someone like Jaden, and Jaden isn't the person's name, but when we go through and watch them use the system, we start to realize that it is actually the system that is holding Jaden back. The result of the new design meant that there was slower handling, more effort, and increased fatigue for Jaden, which meant higher error potential and greater burnout risk. It just goes unnoticed and misdiagnosed because in this case, productivity doesn't crash. Jaden didn't suddenly take a nosedive. It just meant that it leaked out. Jaden's productivity was a leak that got picked up slowly, and then the problem was a Jaden problem as opposed to an accessibility problem. So what if the employee isn't underperforming? What if the system is? The organisation sees the longer handling time and assumes it's a performance issue, but the testing revealed that the workflow itself created unnecessary effort. One task alone took 40 tab stops. So the controls are technically keyboard accessible. All of those tab stops work. Everything that Jaden needed to interact with was accessible, technically. But operable isn't the same as efficient. So rather than thinking about why is Jaden slower, look at what is making the task harder for Jaden, and then ask whether that difficulty is unique to Jaden or if it's creating friction for everyone. Because that turns accessibility into a productivity issue, an inclusion issue, and a system opportunity. And then we have Aisha. Aisha's blind and uses a screen reader. And in testing, she counted image-based OTPs, so with no text alternatives, unlabeled controls, including transfer buttons, inaccessible statements with her bank. So she was sent statements as PDFs that weren't tagged. She wasn't able to do things that she needed to do. She was given visual only information, and so she had to continually call the call center. but the call center didn't know where to send that information to say that this is a problem or fully understand why it was a problem. So the data says that the customer needs additional support. An assumption is that some customers just require assistance. But the hidden question flips that around. Why does our digital service require them to call? So, looking at Aisha, there's an assumption of additional support. If the system was built accessibly, if Aisha's statements came out as tagged PDFs that she could read, she wouldn't have to contact the call center so often. If Aisha was applying for a home loan and those same PDFs weren't available to her for her screen reader, then she would have to get somebody else to read through those documents for her before she is able to sign something. And she may not even be able to sign it herself if the signing option isn't accessible. And you think about it, if you're a person who's adult enough to buy a home, you should be adult enough to be able to read your own documents without having to rely on somebody else. So Aisha isn't dependent. The system created her dependency. So there could be times when, if Aisha's getting a code where she can't read the code herself, she might not be able to sign into her own online banking, which means that she has to get somebody else to help her with that as well. So when you bring people like Aisha into your user testing, you get to hear about her actual experience, and she can tell you where the system is failing her. And then it reframes the problem from how do we support this customer to why did we build a system that requires this customer to be supported? So we've got 3 people, 3 symptoms, and 1 pattern. So the organisation is seeing low digital engagement, poor staff performance, and increased support. And it's assuming that older customers don't like digital, employees are underperforming, customer needs extra assistance because the customer's blind. So clearly you need to help that customer more, rather than looking that the experience doesn't work with the customer's needs, that the system is creating unnecessary effort for your staff member, or the system's preventing independence. Because if something's accessible, then most people can complete things independently. So these are 3 very different organizational metrics, and each carried an easy assumption about the person. But then each was reframed once accessibility testing was applied. So the 4 methods are complementary, not interchangeable. So analytics tells you what happens. Automated diagnostics flag where a technical problem might exist, fast and at scale. WCAG audits confirm conformance against standards. All really, really important. We need to analyze, we need to know where our problems are, we need to know where there's dropouts, timeouts, error rates, or conversion issues. That's how we keep our businesses going. We need to look at things that are scalable, our automated diagnostics, and we need to look at our WCAG audits to make sure things are built correctly and meet conformance levels. But user testing with disabilities is what we find out what is actually happening. Real people, real assistive technology, real tasks, and the real workarounds that they create. Because quite often the way that an accessibility professional goes through and works through something is not necessarily the way a real user uses it, because they're self-taught. A lot of the time, an accessibility auditor knows more about accessibility than the end user. They might not be someone who loves computers and loves computing systems. They might be just someone who has to use what they use to get by, and they've made their own workarounds. So because something's built right doesn't mean that people know that it's been built right or how to use it. So you need to speak to people to find out how they're doing things, and involving real people, real assistive technology, real tasks, real environments. So none of the first 3 replace speaking to people, and you should really have speaking to people on your agendas. And this is a part that's often missing from accessibility programs. So you can have highly skilled accessibility professionals who are excellent at understanding WCAG and identifying technical failures. But there's a difference between knowing what a system should do and watching a real person try to use it. Only people can show you how long a task really takes, and that is based on their level of ability and comfortability with their assistive technology. Not everybody's a power user, and not everybody is a brand new user. And then you've got all the people in between, and it's really important to test consistently and test with different people. You don't know how often some people retry. We've got somebody on our user panel who has cerebral palsy and has some tremors, but this person is probably the most determined person that I've ever met. She will try and try and try again until she gets something. So she will retry until she gets right, and she will only give up if she can absolutely not do something. You don't see when people become confused. When you're building something yourself, you know how it's meant to work, what's meant to happen, and the expectation's already there. When you put your product in front of somebody who's never been presented with it before, their assumptions are often things that you've never even thought of. You don't know when they lose trust, when they actually give up. You don't know if they've got a spreadsheet that they keep outside of the system at work because they've worked out their own workarounds. So the diagnostic value comes from seeing the interaction between the person, their assistive technology, the environment, and the task. When we do user testing, we generally do it remotely so that our people are working on their own devices, working in their own environments, and working with their own setups. You can bring somebody in to do some user testing on your devices, but it won't generally have the same setup, and even something down to a slightly different keyboard layout can really affect how somebody experiences your product. And you can't diagnose lived experience from a checklist. A checklist can't show you how long a task really takes. It can't show you that somebody has to get their colleague to help them get through one bit of the task because for some reason it's not keyboard accessible for them. So you really need to speak to people as well as doing your other testing. So compliance asks, does this meet the standard? WCAG, automated tools, and conformance check all matters and shouldn't be dismissed, but they only describe the system. Accessibility as a diagnostic asks a different question. Who is struggling here and why? That question only gets answered by watching the interaction between the system and the person. Don't just ask if you're compliant. Ask if people can really succeed. And I mean really succeed. Just because there is a workaround or technically somebody can do something and it does meet WCAG and you can get from point A to point B if you know the special magic word to get you there. That's not necessarily accessible because people need to be able to do something easily and in the way that they need to be able to do it. So start with the data that you already have. Look at high abandonment or drop-offs, where people are dropping off, where they're abandoning the path, where they're having higher error rates, longer completion times. Your higher error rate could be because your error management isn't being managed correctly. So somebody's struggling to understand what the error message is telling them or how to get past it. If there's repeated support contacts, if it's that particular customer, maybe delve a little bit deeper and find out, where the issue, what they're actually trying to do, rather than maybe working through a standard help message. So if the customer's experienced this, tell them to do X, Y, and Z. Find out what the customer's using. Are they using assistive technologies? Looking at repeated support contacts, low adoptions, and staff workarounds. And then get user testing to investigate. So recruit people with relevant lived experience. It's really important to speak to people who are your customers and who are your staff that need to have different assistance and different access. Screen readers, magnifiers, keyboards, alternative input devices, and watch them do the whole journey. So watch them go through from point A to point B and see how long it takes and what barriers they come across. And all of the barriers are valid. I've been in many user testing. We do like a little debrief after each session. And I've had conversations with clients where they've said, well, but that passed the audit. So it's compliant, it passed the audit. but we watch people struggle with it. So sometimes we have to redesign something, even though it's been designed with accessibility in mind. Sometimes it needs a few extra tweaks. So make things actionable. You don't need a full accessibility program to start, and it's not just your accessibility team that this is reliant on. It belongs to everybody. So look where people are already struggling in the data that you already have. Use testing to investigate, recruiting people with relevant lived experience across screen readers, magnifiers, different alternate inputs, and different levels of experience. And then turn the diagnosis into action by following the chain from drop off to barrier to root cause to solution. So, what is your data trying to tell you? The signals are already there, the diagnosis might just be missing. So, looking at a journey with an unexplained drop off, a demographic that isn't engaging, a higher support customer journey, a process that requires workaround, a product that isn't being adopted, a workforce performance problem, a form that times out. The diagnosis might be missing the root cause. So, if anyone out there recognizes any of these scenarios, unexplained drop offs, etc., reach out and discuss with us how testing and research with people with disabilities might be able to help you find the barriers that your existing diagnostics can't see. And maybe once you have a chat with those people, you can then bring it to the exec to show them exactly where the problems are.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Really appreciate everything you've gone through today, and a lot of thanks in the chat as well. We do have a few questions, if happy to answer those. The first one is from Jason. And he says some of the challenges in reviewing pages or trying to review symptoms is that the organization, POs, BAs / technical team are all very familiar with how our pages work. So to us, it all seems simple and easy to follow. The real way to get better feedback would obviously be to talk to users. Is there any recommendation you have on how to best get user feedback? Do polls on web pages, email surveys, etc. work? Should we try and use incentives to try to recruit a set of people from existing users to regularly connect with?
So at TTC, we have a panel of users from different backgrounds with different disabilities who use different assistive technologies. So we can help put you in touch with people, and we run sessions from full facilitation to just supporting with recruitment. But yeah, look, it's really hard with polls. I know that myself, when I complete a service and then I get an email the next day saying, how did we do? And I'm like, it's already done. I don't care. Um, Generally, I don't know that there's a lot of uptake on those polls, but if you look at your customer feedback that you already get and look for anyone that's mentioned that they're a screen reader user, that they have an accessibility issue, and contact them and speak to them. Go to them directly. And then if you are going to bring them in to chat further as far as, whether you're going to interview them, whether it's online or in person, or whether you want to engage them in user testing, yes, you should always incentivize them. And that's generally through payment because you are paying for these people's lived experience, their experience with their tools. For a screen reader user, you're paying for the experience of that person who has put into learning that screen reader and working out how they get around. And honestly, you never truly understand until you start seeing people use their tools. I was doing auditing for probably about 7 years, and then I had the realization, mind blown, that I'd actually never seen anybody use any of these tools. I'd never seen a real screen reader, apart from, maybe the odd YouTube video. I'd never actually sat with anyone who was a screen reader user and watched how they did something. And then I went and got a job to teach people how to use screen readers. And then I learned how people use screen readers and different tools and things like that. So definitely pay people. Definitely the assumption that you know the service, the products, the product owners, the BAs, and everyone. there's too much knowledge. So also getting someone on your team who has an access need to go through the service, valuable, but also more valuable that you get actual customers in front of you.
Great. Thanks so much, Charlie. Another question from Dan is, uh, what do you do when you have clashing accessibility needs amongst your users?
Always a really difficult one. And so often, when we're doing user testing, we often test with because budgetary constraints, we'll often have one screen reader user, one person who is keyboard only, maybe one or two neurodivergent, cognitive disability people, and someone who uses magnification. And so you've got a lot of really competing needs. And we'll watch one session and we'll get into the debrief after, and the client will go, "Oh, that was amazing. We're going to go and fix X, Y, and Z straight away." And it's like, we need to just stop and consider, like, when you need to watch all of the sessions, because you'll actually see that by doing that, you'll actually ruin it for this person. So I guess always making sure that there is an alternative way round. um it's not an exact science, and unfortunately you can't make everybody happy, but you have to make everything accessible. So, and the other thing that we get a lot is, who do we fix for first? Do we fix for the screen reader? Do we fix for the person who requires magnification? Do we fix for keyboard only? Do we fix for alternate input? Do we fix for high cognitive load? And the thing is that some people have more than one disability. We might have a blind user who has cerebral palsy, so they might be iPad only and only using touch screens. We might have somebody who has low vision and also has ADHD or autism, so they need they need everything fixed. They need everything fixed because they have one more than one access need on what they're doing. So I guess trying to do as less harm as possible. So not blocking someone completely might not be the perfect remedy for a particular group, but if it means that another group can still get through that part, then that's the one to go with. But sometimes it's really difficult, and there's discussions going back and forth with colleagues of, well, if we fix this for this person, it's going to break this for somebody else, and then finding that middle ground and thinking outside of the box on how you can do things. And again, talk to more people. The more people you talk to, suddenly you'll come up with a solution and go, "Oh, I've never thought of it that way. And now we can go and fix this," which actually won't break it for them. So yeah, talking to people and experience.
Thanks, Charlie. The next question is, at what point in the development or design lifecycle would we start to engage users in user testing?
From the moment you have an idea. And that's again, project constraints, budgetary constraints. The earlier you can speak to somebody, the earlier that you can understand your end user, the better an experience you'll build. So if you're starting to talk to general population, general customers, to get an idea of, what they're looking for, include people with disabilities in those early discussions. There are times you can do testing. So, you can do interviews, and get feedback on what you're building and how to build it. You can do user testing on prototypes. It's harder for people, for screen reader users to test on prototypes. I've done it before. It can be done. It's a little bit clunky, because a prototype isn't fully accessible to a screen reader. But the earlier you can speak to someone, like any testing, the earlier you get things looked at, the earlier you speak to people, the easier and cheaper it is to fix anything and to make any changes. And often like I said, you come up with ideas that you'd never considered before, and you realize bits that you might have been missing. At a minimum, I would get user testing done prior to a release. So if you've created something new, if you're redeveloping something, even if you've had an audit, auditing is really important. Getting those technical things done is really important. As much as I always say I don't care about WCAG, I do. And audits are really important. But once it's been audited, putting it in front of real users, you'll still find issues that you hadn't considered. And it could be a fully accessible, compliant website. You might have your certificate to say that you are compliant, and you might pass every WCAG checklist. However, there might be things that, for whatever reason, and it could just be that the language that's being used doesn't make sense to the person, or out of visual context, um, even though technically it might pass WCAG, it might pass an audit. Once you put everything together for a user who's moving through your page, or your system at speed on their screen reader, suddenly something doesn't make sense. Suddenly things just seem a little bit out of alignment, and you might find that they have to keep going back and checking something and then going, okay, yep, I get what it is now, and then moving forward. And you might see those barriers that get put into place. You might find that you've put all of your call to action buttons far on the right side, all of your accordion buttons far on the right hand side. And when you do your browser zoom, everything falls in and reflows nicely. But you get a user who's using a Windows magnifier, like I was talking about before, where they only see a very, very small portion of the screen, and they might lose interest in where they're going, and think that there's nothing there. So they miss all of those call to actions. They miss the accordion drop downs. We had one recently where there was a toolbar, and all of the menu items were in the toolbar except the profile part, which was up in the top right hand corner. And somebody with low vision scanned across, and there was the company logo, there was the menu, and then over on the right hand side, which we often see out of alignment with that menu, was the profile. And they kept missing the profile because they went along and along and along. They saw they got to the end of the menu, and then they assumed there was nothing further on the page. So they really struggled in finding where that profile button was because it wasn't in alignment to anything else and it seemed too far away on the page. Never would have known that had we not put it in front of somebody with low vision.
Wonderful. One more question from Elba. See AI playing a meaningful role in accessibility research, user research today, or is it mostly useful for catching some obvious issues before user testing?
Um, I think that AI is playing a role in everything we do, whether we like it or not. I know for a lot of people who have access needs, AI can be really good. One way I've seen it being used in user testing is creating profiles. And this is one that scares me, is that AI is going to build profiles of who your customers are. So, it might be Brian, who's 48 and a screen reader user, and based on all of these things, we've created a Brian persona. So we're no longer going to go out and ask Brian his thoughts, because we have enough rich data from through AI, and we can create personas and run it through those things. And honestly, you will never and any kind of user persona, you will never meet all of your customer needs through personas and using AI. You still need to talk to people. AI is a great tool. It's great for people that are neurodivergent. It's great for people who do have access needs, and it does open a lot of doors. But it's not going to do everything for us. It's not going to do everything from an auditing point of view, and it's certainly not going to do everything from a user testing point of view, because you need people's real lived experience, and pushing them all into one user persona and not thinking that you don't have to go out and speak to people is going to really narrow down the experience that you're putting onto your site and in your testing.
Thanks, Charlie. I think we've got time for one more question from Sophie. What measures do you recommend for ensuring the literacy you use in digital tools is accessible for all users as well, not just the format or layout, but the actual words?
Is that related to the system content or in testing? I don't know if
Sophie, obviously, feel free to add in a
yeah.
clarifying question. I feel as if the question is about the content, so making sure that the content itself is accessible in terms of maybe reading level or things like that.
So again, test
System,
test with users.
sorry, Sophie, thank you.
Test with users with different reading levels, test with users from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and that's all of the testing that we do. It's not just with people with disability, it's also people from different minority groups, people who have lower literacy. And you do need to, if you are doing user testing with people with lower literacy, you need to meet them where they're at. You need to make sure that your instructions are clear. And make sure that they can comprehend and understand the information that's being presented to them on the site, and take their feedback. It doesn't always mean that, words have to be really, really super simplified. Different things can be used. You can use imagery along with text to help people understand the contents of the page. There's lots of things that can be done. But again, speaking with people to find out what their needs are. And I'm learning all the time. I have been doing user testing for um, probably 12 years now as my main role. And I still learn something new constantly by speaking to different people and different experiences. So ensure that you're keeping your content in a reasonable reading level. Breaking up blocks of content, people find often is easier to digest. So using, instead of large blocks of text, breaking up with big images or small images so that the brain has a little bit of rest time between. People have told me that that helps them. Font size, thinking about your font size as well. A larger font size can sometimes help people to comprehend if they have lower literacy levels. There's lots of things that can be done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Charlie. So we might leave it there for today. Thank you, everyone, also for your engagement and your questions. Really appreciate that. We had some really great discussions as well. So thanks again, Charlie, for the session today. Thank you to everybody who attended as well. As we mentioned, we will send out a recording of this as well in the next few days. Or early next week, along with the links and resources that we've also shared in the chat. So again, thank you so much for coming along, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thanks, everyone.